appreciate it. And hi, everyone, from wherever you're calling. It is so awesome to be here with all of you, and I'm excited to share some insights. So let's see. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Always good to get that feedback back. All right. Well, thank you all again for joining me on this live lesson on a topic that I am incredibly passionate about called customer discovery. So why don't we get into it? Oops, sorry. One ahead. Before we dive into today's lesson, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. My name is Prerna Singh, and I like to joke that my journey with customer discovery kicked off when I was 10 years old. I was all about making the perfect cup of like Indian chai or tea, for those of you that might be familiar with, for my friends and family. But it was always kind of like a hit or miss affair. So one afternoon after school, I had all my friends come over for what I called the ultimate chai challenge. And I brewed up 5 different kinds of teas and with like different proportions of ingredients and had my friends do a blind taste test and then fill out a survey with like the thing that they like the best. That feedback helped me figure out the right mix of tea, water, milk, ginger, cardamom, which is still my go-to recipe today. But young Prerna really learned a very important lesson that day, and that's what I really want to share with you. It wasn't about what I liked, but it was about what my friends wanted in their cup. And that changed everything for me. I've brought that customer research and discovery as a skill set to each of my roles in product to help really unlock powerful insights that drive really meaningful experiences and business growth. Whether I was scaling a business 20x while I was the VP of product at a really early stage startup called Coedition, or helping navigate a really challenging time for an in-person business during COVID in my most recent role as VP of product and design at Meetup. Through all of these really hard moments and shifting contexts, I've relied on one constant: focusing on what the customer needs. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So in this short time that we have together, I want to talk about what customer discovery is, why we do it, and my take on what the different kinds of customer discovery methods are that you can perform. I want to keep this fun and interactive, so there'll be a few moments where I'll ask you to, jot some answers down in chat. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to also ask those, and we'll save some time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. So let's just get started. And this is the first of the interactive session parts of the section that we have today. So I'm going to start off with a question. I'd like everyone in chat to put a guess for what they think all of these products that you see on the screen have in common. And I'll give everyone, let's say, 30 seconds to do so.
It's a hard one.
Okay. Failed to meet customer needs. Consumer products. They are all consumer products. Failed launch. Fulfill a customer problem. Okay. Correct. They are all products. Yes, he says there was a lot of hype around the launch, but they were unsuccessful. Okay. All right. Feel free to keep adding your answers, but I think some of it was a little bit of a dead giveaway. They all failed. And specifically, I highlighted some of these things because they didn't go deep in understanding what their customers needed, or in the case of where a prior product already existed, like Coke, it really underestimated the emotional connection customers already had with the original formula, so much so that they shunned the new Coke. So that was a picture of new Coke, by filing lawsuits against the company for changing its iconic drink. And so all of those are really great examples, and maybe things that you might have already heard of, Juicero and whatnot, of failed product launches. What I really wanted to talk about, though, is that they're not alone. And sometimes we hear about these really big brands that fail, but according to this Harvard Business School study, every year over 30,000 new products are introduced, and about 95% of them fail. That's crazy. And I'm sure, honestly, many of us have experienced this at least once in our product careers. I know that I certainly have as well. Yeah. So, what do we do? Like, are we just destined to all be total failures? Well, luckily for you all, you're here today, and it might be other people's fates, but it's not going to be yours. Enter customer discovery, where the scientific method meets social psychology. When performed correctly, customer discovery is an incredibly powerful tool. It's a methodology and a mindset that focuses on understanding the needs, desires, and frustrations of a target customer base. And honestly, going beyond that, finding ways to the best way to solve those issues. This is really critical of making sure that we aren't building something that no one wants, like my chai recipe that nobody cared about, or worse, building something that we think people want based on our own biases. Customer discovery takes the bias out of the equation, ultimately allowing us to build products and businesses that are incredibly successful. So now the question is, well, how do we actually conduct customer discovery? So this is part 2 of where you are all interactive. I want everyone to take 30 seconds and jot up to 3 words on what they think discovery is. Okay, testing critical assumptions, understanding behaviors and needs, understanding desired outcome, listening, observing, empathizing, like this, asking questions, understanding customer needs. Yeah, all great responses. Diving deeper, understanding the problem. Yep, totally. What I really want to focus on today, and I think this is where when people think of customer discovery, there's this common conception, while not wrong, is that customer discovery is this idea that you're finding people to talk to, asking them a bunch of questions, and then leveraging that for insights. But in today's lesson, I really want to expand that worldview. In fact, where I think there is so much opportunity to expand that worldview is thinking about all the different sources of information that we can use to learn and understand our customer better. And for my years doing customer discovery and research with my teams, I've really found that there are buckets of information that we can leverage to understand that customer better. Some sources of information we need to directly reach out to our customer to get. And some sources of data are readily available because the customer is actively engaging with that product and giving us information real time. So it's up to us to figure out what sources of data we have and how to consolidate all these different sort of sources of truth to create and tell a really compelling narrative of what our customers need. And so I want to get into kind of the meat of today's talk and expand that definition of what I mean by customer discovery to consider all these different types of customer feedback, not just what you might traditionally think of customer discovery, which is interviews or surveys. That kind of feedback I call direct feedback, which is incredibly useful, but can require a lot of time investment. Today, we're going to explore not only what direct feedback looks like, but we'll also look at these other different types of customer feedback called indirect, inferred, and intervention are as different methods for collecting customer intent, friction points, and problems. I'm going to go into this kind of at a high level, but feel free to ask questions in the chat. Again, I'd like to keep this interactive, and we'll have some time at the very end to also ask questions. So let's start off with what direct feedback is. I would say at a whole, this is probably the method that most people are familiar with and what they associate customer discovery with. Direct feedback is what customers say to you directly when you prompt them. This can take many different forms, but popular examples of direct feedback come in the form of surveys, NPS scores, in-app ratings, or even contextual interviews that you might conduct with a customer, and that those could either be moderated or unmoderated. The pros of doing this kind of research are very clear. You're hearing straight from the customer herself. The other benefit is that you get very targeted information, and you don't have to go on a hunting expedition for relevant information because you're asking the questions you need answers to. When I was at Coedition building a marketplace for plus size women's fashion, we actually went to our customers' homes to understand how our customers like to shop and learn a lot more about her preferences. This actually gave us a really deep understanding of how and when she likes to shop. And that led us to really creating a much more intentional shopping experience for her on our site. Now, for the downsides of this method, one, it can be really costly to set up. There's like some overhead admin that you need to sort of take this that takes up time, especially if you're trying to bring in people to talk to. You not only have to figure out who you need to talk to, but once you do, figuring out how to reach out to those people, schedule them, taking the time to talk to them. For things like surveys, there's a lot of different tools out there that can make your life pretty easy to set up, but still requires a deep investment to making sure that you have all of the means to get it up and running. The second thing and the downsides about this is it takes your customers time, and that can lead to fatigue. Our customers' time is really, really a precious resource, and it can easily cross into either survey fatigue, or again, if you're asking the same people again over and over again for feedback, it can really impact your ability to gain insight from them. Or there just might be customers who don't want to participate in your customer research studies. You can obviously make that up sometimes by offering folks, some incentives, either money or a discount off of your product, but ultimately you have to treat this like a precious resource. And then the third downside about this particular method is that sometimes you might actually get biased responses because you're often asking questions out of context. Asking people questions about how they might act in a situation, or even asking them to explain how they might have or how they did act in the past, can introduce biases into your response, as opposed to observing what people are actually doing when they're faced with a task or an objective. So just think a little bit more about how far you are removing someone from the context that you're asking them about. So if there's a construction worker that you're trying to interview, asking them questions away from a construction site and asking them to recall can lead to more bias than maybe actually going to a construction site, seeing how people are doing things, and then gaining insight from that. So while this is a really powerful tool to keep in your customer discovery toolkit, it's not always the easiest to implement, and it's not always the easiest to sort of make sense of, and can lead to sort of some more bias. And that's where I'd like to really introduce a couple other options for you to conduct customer feedback. The next bucket of customer feedback is what I like to call indirect feedback. This is what people or customers say about you, but unprompted. So think of this as website reviews, social media comments, discussion forums, discussion forums on Reddit, or even internal sources like customer support tickets or bug reports. All of these sources are customers engaging with your product somehow, but you're not asking them for that feedback. At Meetup, this was actually a really powerful source of information for us because we had a very passionate group of organizers as our user base. In fact, we had a group of organizers who created their own discussion board separate from Meetup called Discuss Meetup to talk about issues that they were having and how to hack our platform for their needs. My team and I often kind of incognito would scour these forums for insights because it was really valuable getting that unfiltered feedback from our users in almost real time. If you don't have something like this, consider setting up a community for your users because there's so much you can learn from users engaging with other users. The pros to this particular type of customer feedback type is that unlike direct feedback, it doesn't really cost any time to set up, especially if some of the sources are external, like social media feeds or external review sites like Google or Trustpilot. Those are publicly available and accessible. This is also a really great method to overcome the cold start problem. If you have no product or no customers, you might be wondering, where do I get started? How can I get started? The nice thing about indirect feedback is that much of this information can be accessed publicly. And you can look up what people are saying about maybe your perceived competitors or established businesses in this space. It can allow you to gauge what that white space might be for a new product to enter the market without having to invest really deeply into collecting customer data. The cons to this, of course, or this particular method, is that sometimes it's the vocal minority that speaks the loudest. In a Facebook group with Meetup organizers of like over 1,000 organizers, I noticed that there were actually a select few that would be constantly posting in that group, and often that feedback would be incredibly negative. So I sort of instructed my team to not base all of our decisions off of exactly what was being said in that group, but to really understand if that sentiment could be widely shared amongst the larger organizer population. And in some cases, I found that feedback was extremely localized to a small group of users and generally didn't apply to that wider user base. Either way, it still gives you an idea of what people are saying without you prompting them, and that can be incredibly valuable. The second sort of con to this particular type of feedback is the extensibility of the feedback. You might hear about what's wrong about your product today, but it doesn't give you insight into what your customers might need from you tomorrow. As opposed to direct feedback, where you can ask users directly about the merits of a future idea, you don't really get the chance to do so here. So you have to kind of tread carefully and make sure that you're considering the feedback that you get in this particular bucket type in the context that it's being given, and use other methods to support your analysis and insights. The next type of customer feedback I want to talk to you all about is what I call inferred. Now, this is pretty straightforward. This is any information that you can derive from the data you're collecting about your customer as they're using your product. This can help us understand behaviors of what people are or are not doing as they're interacting with your product and how they may or may not be converting. This is a really powerful tool, especially when you're in the early stages of customer discovery. At Coedition, we established a pattern of consistently looking at our funnel metrics, and this allowed us to uncover a pretty substantial checkout problem. However, one of the downsides of this collection method is that it very rarely tells you why something is happening. And that's what happened to us at Coedition. We knew we had a pretty big problem with our cart abandon rate, but it took a combination of methods to understand the why behind what was actually going on. So don't underestimate the power of looking at data and using it to either identify problems or to gut check what you think might be a problem. And then lastly, I want to talk about I think perhaps my favorite type of customer feedback method is what I like to call the intervention method. This is information you can collect by intervening right at the point in time when the customer is experiencing friction in your product. So I want to go back to my co-edition example. We knew we had a really high cart abandon problem, but we didn't know why. So I staged my intervention. If a customer dropped in the middle of checkout, I ended up sending her an email straight from my email account. It was no like fancy cart abandon email or anything. And just simply asking her why she dropped and if there was anything I could do to help her complete her purchase. To my complete surprise, I got several responses back, and all of them pointed to operational issues in our process, like the fact that we didn't have any expedited shipping options, we weren't giving people insight into like the delivery dates for their packages. These all became our top company priorities and helped us increase our conversion by 20%. If you're trying to figure out why something is a problem, this is an excellent method in a very scrappy way to get information quickly and be able to make better decisions about where your product needs to improve. Ultimately, the one takeaway that I want you to leave this session from is that as you engage on your customer discovery journey with your product, there's no one right method. But I hope today kind of has opened doors for you to think about different opportunities to conduct discovery with your customers and get creative with how you can improve your understanding of them. So with that, I wanted to just share that if you're eager to learn more and interested in getting more hands-on, today we kept it at a very high level. But if you're really interested in understanding each of these different methods at a deeper level, please visit Gigantic to reserve your seat to my 6-week customer research and discovery course. We'll go into much deeper depth of how to actually set up your customer discovery for success. We'll talk about hypothesis development, persona development, and really work on a project. Everyone works on an individual project to lead a customer discovery research project of their own using the methods we just talked about. So definitely check out the course there. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to just stop my screen.
Thank you so much, Prerna. I just wanted to jump on the back of your last slide and just say this is the first cohort that we're running for Prerna's course. It kicks off on January 22nd. And like I said, it's first come, first serve. We like to limit the capacity to make sure that your live sessions with your expert mentor are as valuable as possible. So we like to keep them small. So if you did want to sign up for her course kicking off on January 22nd, go to the webpage and reserve your seat. And that's how you do it. Enrollment just opened today. With that promo over, let's dive into Q&A and questions. Open floor if anybody's got any questions, either about what Prerna spoke about today or about anything that's going on in your product world that you would like some advice or to talk about, or anything about the course. I'll kick it off with a question then, Prerna.
Sure.
And then we could head to Abraham. I know that you just put your camera on, so maybe we've got a question there. So I had a quick question about your meetup time. You said that you led that through, obviously, the pandemic. Was there any interesting customer research and discovery that you did that shifted how meetup was working, or what were the users saying at that time? And did you create like online meetup offerings as a result of what you found?
Yeah. Great question. And 100% had to lean into customer research and discovery especially in the face of so much uncertainty and so many kind of behaviors that we took for granted changing. So for I realized I also talked about Meetup and didn't actually explain what Meetup was for anybody that's unfamiliar. Meetup is a social community platform where we bring together organizers who are interested in leading communities and organizing events and helping them drive members to those events and groups. So the entire premise of Meetup for the last 20 years or before, whatever, it was like 16 years before that, was predicated on people meeting up in person. And that was really kind of the business model. And with COVID coming to head, it really sort of changed this idea that the entire premise of the company was built on in-person interaction. And so we really had to pivot to this idea of like, okay, now interaction has to take place online. And we observed through some customer research that we ended up doing, both on the member side and the organizer side, how that exactly shifted. One of the insights that I'll talk about, because I think it's so fascinating, is just thinking a little bit more about how the member sort of decision making sort of shifted. So before the pandemic, members would come to Meetup, and this is how we were organized too, by the way. So like members would come to Meetup, we'd have like a big sort of like search bar to say, hey, like I'm looking for events, in this category on this date. And there's this idea that like people were coming and planning for what event to go to, like next week, next weekend. And because again, like you had a schedule and people were often trying to figure out between lots of different events that they were going, where the gaps were in their schedule that they could fill by going to a Meetup event. All of that obviously changed because no one was leaving their homes anymore as a result of COVID. And so when we went to figure out like what members needed in the time of COVID, this was the number one insight that we took away from that research, was that actually members needed a way to figure out like what meetups are happening right now, because what they were using Meetup for is actually a way to fill unexpected time that they had. And so we had to kind of restructure how like what the discovery experience looked like for events. And one of the most popular things that we kind of rolled out with during the time of COVID was like meetups happening right now that you could just automatically join. And that was a very cool thing that allowed people to find that connection and not have to like go through this like whole like planning sequence, because they didn't need to anymore. You don't have to figure out how you're going to drive there. You don't have to figure out how you're going to have babysitting or whatnot. You can just join from the comfort of your own home. And that really kind of opened up the possibilities of how and when people were joining meetups.
That makes total sense. A lot of people had a lot of time to kill.
Exactly.
We have some questions coming in the chat here. So we've got Don Parker asking the first one. So how do you address testing a new concept when the product doesn't even exist yet? 3 upvotes. This is, I'd like to know this as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, like I said, some of it you can start by doing some of that like market research. So that indirect method that I kind of talked about, or gave a little bit of a preview of, you can kind of start to see like, okay, if this product were to exist, like what are the current alternatives today, and start to look at what people are saying about those alternatives. And that's a really great way to kind of gauge, like, again, what some of that white space might be. And gives you a starting point in terms of developing a hypothesis. And that really is honestly the critical thing for a new concept. You need to know like what exactly you're trying to prove. This is the scientific method portion of customer discovery, where you really kind of need to start there. I know we didn't cover that today, but really is kind of one of the basic pieces that you need to have really powerful insights. And then from there, what I'd say is then you can actually employ some of these other methods. Once you've identified the hypothesis that you have, you can start to now identify who to talk to and, be able to bring people in for interviews, or send surveys out. There's lots of different services now that will even get, you enter in who you want to talk to, and they will go and recruit those people on your behalf. So lots of different options, but I think really what it comes down to is really doing kind of your upfront research and having insights into your hypothesis from the get-go, and then you can employ some of these other methods. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And I'm also going to jump down to David's question because it builds on Don's question there, just to keep the flow. So how much emphasis do you then put on product education before performing discovery? As an example, a new product with a clear solution, but a complex process for a product that doesn't exist tends to leave folks with almost an overload of information.
I'm trying to parse out what the question is. David, if you're on, can you give me an example of this part where you were asking about a new product with a clear solution, but a complex process for a product that doesn't exist? I'd love to hear a little bit more. But
I don't know if it'd be easier for me to just speak, actually.
That's perfect. Yes. Hi.
Hi. I appreciate you taking the question. I think the sort of goal that I'm trying to get at is in a scenario where you've got a product that has a clear solution. So let's say energy. You need to reduce energy usage within a certain type of infrastructure. Okay, well, now we're providing an infrastructure, but the complex process that comes with it tends to leave people not really understanding the questions to ask or formulate. And so being able to provide them discovery questions sort of gets them along. But when there's so much information for a very clear, simple solution, which is reduce energy consumption, as an example, does that make more sense?
No, it does make a lot more sense. And I totally get it. I actually, this is interesting. I cover this in the course itself, which is things that might seem like a very clear sort of solution are often not. And what you end up having to do is continue to ask yourself, okay, why or how? What needs to be true in order for the solution to exist? I call that opportunity solution mapping. And it's a really great, I didn't coin the term by any means. It's a really popular framework that Teresa Torres has developed and I've used with my teams. So it's definitely worth checking out. And I go into more detail in the course, but this idea that essentially, even for every solution, there's maybe 5 or 6 or multiple assumptions you're probably making. Each of those need to be tested and validated until you can get to that sort of solution and feel confident that that's the direction you want to go in. And so the key there, I think, is to be able to break up that really complex sort of set of processes into smaller bite-sized efforts that you go sort of test and validate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Good question.
Thank you, David. And anybody, feel free to shout your questions out as well. I know we have a lot coming in the chat, but if you want to turn your camera on and microphone on, I encourage you to do that. We could go down what's coming in the chat now. I got a direct message. So if you want to, you could share those as well. This is one from Namarata. So if you're helping a startup map their customer journey and you're coming into that startup cold, what questions should you ask the startup team to understand their customer better?
Okay. I found myself in very similar situations, and it's not a question, but honestly, kind of just a mindset that I like to come in with, which is I know nothing about your product or what your product or your business, and I am coming from a pure just a place from pure curiosity. And so while actually I might have execs coming in and telling me certain things, I treat it all as just sort of pieces of information that I now need to go validate on my own, because oftentimes even asking execs for like what they might know comes from a very sort of biased perspective. And so you have to, again, like I said, with any information that you are collecting, you have to contextualize it in like how and why people are telling you certain things. And so it's not that I take it with a grain of salt, it's very important, but then I make it sort of my own like fact finding mission to say, okay, well then show me the data that says that that's actually true. And I've asked this question to startups, and they're like, well, like this is what we believe to be true. I'm like, okay, that's great. Where's the data? And sometimes even those kinds of questions then prompt more questions, and that's where I know, okay, I have an opportunity to come in and really help establish like some like a source of truth, and then that's what we sort of use to base future decisions off of. Does that
Thank
answer your question, Amrita, or is there any
it,
other
it,
follow-up?
it no, it totally does. I mean, because, when you come in cold and a startup is like, okay, I want you to do this specific thing, and you're like, okay, I can't do that specific thing without knowing more around it. And they're like, well, that's all we have the budget for, right? So then you're saying, like, okay, let me provide the best work product I can provide for you, given the constraints. And so that's why I want to go in with what I have an idea of how I want to approach it, but to your point, I want to create those assumptions. Even if they aren't able to provide that data, I want to document it to say, based on what so this is the context based on which this journey mapping was done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you
No,
very much.
I think it's sometimes like a tough position to be in. And if you can create the space, what I found is I'll be like, all right, exactly what you did, which is like, okay, I'll hold these assumptions true. I'll spend some time seeing if I can find the data to
Right.
suggest, otherwise, suggest if that's true or otherwise. And then, use any other kind of customer research and discovery methods to inform how I might go about sort of building the product if my feet were actually held to a fire, and be like, no, you must build something. But in those contexts, honestly, I think then that's actually where, some education around like, hey, we can spend time doing this, but here are the costs of getting it
Right.
wrong.
Right.
And if we don't invest the 1, 2, 3 weeks up front to really make sure that we've understood what the problem is, we've understood what we're trying to achieve, the metrics for success, which I think
Right.
are often
Right.
kind of not even clearly defined in those instances, then the outcome is not even going to be any fraction of the success you expect to see.
Right. So I think just iterating and creating this as a hypothesis, here's the assumptions we made. This is one hypothesis. We'll create the journey map based on this hypothesis. And if that proves to be incorrect, then we'll come back and iterate again. I think that's how I would probably approach it with them.
Yeah,
Thanks.
exactly. And it allows you to also start like using this as a way to eliminate like possibilities of like,
Right.
okay, this is like what I say about like experiments. Like the worst outcome is not failing. The worst outcome is not having learned anything.
Absolutely.
And so think about it from that perspective on how, even for yourself, can you, find a scrappy way to test their idea, and without having to invest so much, and then use that as a way to further your learning.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the question, Amrita.
Thank you. Next question comes from Nikki Clark. Any tips on getting buy-in from the C-suite for direct type of customer discovery? They're worried about people who will realize that we're building behind the sales.
Interesting. I'm assuming this is like for a SaaS product. And so I think in order to, I think two things. One is when you're talking to C-suite, and this doesn't matter for any kind of product. I think, like I was just telling them, Martha, I think sometimes fear also works as well as best as like showing them the opportunity. And so the cost of getting it wrong can actually sometimes be a little bit more easily quantified. And so especially in like a SaaS kind of setting, it's like, hey, if we're not building the right features, like here's what it could mean for, customer retention or for churn. And we need to find ways to make sure that we're or for even customer, like new customer acquisition. And so sometimes quantifying that of saying, hey, this is the cost of not actually knowing what we should be building or getting it right, can inspire C-suite leaders to want to invest that time up front. In terms of like the idea of, your sales team might be going and pitching things, and you might not have actually already built them. I think you can always frame it as, hey, we're either like, you don't have to say like, hey, this is like what we're working on building. You could talk about, hey, we're looking at kind of how our competitors are doing it, and we wanted to kind of understand like what they might be doing right or wrong, and how you might want to actually have how you might actually want to see it as a customer happen. And then I think from another angle to take that is that you can also look at it as like, hey, we have a solution in place, but we want to make sure that we're designing something that has again is more applicable to you or to a specific kind of customer segment. So you don't have to kind of call out that that solution doesn't exist, but use it as a way to kind of enter into a conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, Stevie, if you want to shout your question out, please do. If not, I could read it out. I'll go ahead and read it. So assuming that discovery precedes the product scoping stage, are there times where where a subsequent customer's discovery or usability study will reveal that the original ideation is out of scope? If so, at this point, what are the best options to remedy the situation?
Yeah, I think great question. And I think there's a kind of a meta answer, which is like, we need to figure out like where in our process we might have kind of screwed up or not been able to get that insight sooner in a customer discovery process. So the meta answer is, hey, there's probably something in the process that we should fix so that it doesn't happen again for next time. Now, as far as like what to do about the thing that you actually have an issue with, and if the original ideation is out of scope, I would say, obviously I think it's best to go back to the team and to the drawing board to really kind of understand what the difference was between the hypothesis that you had from the original, from the get-go, from the original sort of discovery, and how that's sort of like materially shifted now with the latest sort of round of discovery. What I've done in those instances is when we know we're kind of like a little bit behind the 8 ball, is that I've used this discovery method called RITE. It's rapid iteration and testing, to kind of see if we can actually take what we've now learned and be able to make rapid improvements, put that in front of customers, and get pretty immediate feedback back as a way to be able to kind of almost catch up on cycles. Feel free to message me. I'm happy to talk a little bit more in detail of like what that actually looks like. But the best thing I could say in that case is to really try to go back to the drawing board as quickly as possible and look at what assumptions are no longer hold true, or now you have more information to suggest otherwise. But at the end of the day, here's what I'll say. It's still a win to not have shipped that thing and have still caught it before it went out to market. So I know it can seem like, oh my God, all this wasted effort, but it really wasn't. And that's precisely the reason why you want to do customer discovery at all points in the customer development process.
That's encouraging, thank you. Krish, I know you're here. Would you like to shout your question out?
Yeah, I can do that. So how do we acquire real-time feedback from our customers, as they are using our product live, virtually, right? Well, without us physically like being there. At meetup.com, like, was there any kind of like a widget or something that was active that was floating on every page? So if users did have opinions or any kind of feedback to provide, they could actually provide it like in real time.
Yeah, great question. So yes, there's definitely lots of different options. Things like, and like an NPS collection, for example. We actually even played around with like where to put it. And where I have found the most value out of, like, let's say getting an NPS response is right after like a major action has like taken place. So in the case of like Meetup, and we really wanted to get a sense of how our organizers felt. We put, let's say, like an NPS widget right after they scheduled an event, because to us, like, that was like the biggest value of Meetup that we were providing, is right after they scheduled and then right after they hosted an event, because those were two moments in the journey where we felt it was really critical to understand customer sentiment, and probably where actually two of the biggest like sort of friction points could exist. So that's what I would kind of like look at, or tell you first, is to like examine your customer journey and look at what are the points where like a major action is taking place, because that's probably the opportunity that you have, or that's probably where people are experiencing the most friction in that journey to begin with. And then find ways to kind of, again, either stage that intervention or ask for that feedback. You can either do that directly in your app. There's so many different options now that exist. If you have like if a tool like Braze, where you can, show people a prompt in the app and have them answer a question, or if you have things like, like Pendo is a great tool, also to be able to kind of have pop-ups when you based on certain triggers or actions taking place. So you can customize these things to very granular levels, so that you are literally asking questions when you know a very specific action has taken place. Krish, does that make sense?
Yeah. So the reason that this question was prompted was because in our SaaS app, we have multiple screens, multiple pages that people go through. Right, the entire customer journey is pretty big, just to get something done. So for specific jobs to be done, we were just kind of brainstorming ideas on how do we actually gather real-time feedback. In a very in a page that most customers don't even go to, but they have a problem when they get there. So yeah, I think that cleared up.
Yeah, I mean, even in that, so then a very specific example, and I not knowing too much about like the SaaS offering, like if there's a specific page that people get stuck on, like even a like support link or a button to say, hey, would you like to talk to someone here, is enough to just get you a signal to say, hey, okay, like clearly we have a problem. And then at some point you're gonna need to like, sit down with some of your customers and actually understand what the problem is, and get in front of them and ask them up, straight up. But I think if you're just looking at, hey, trying to understand how much of a problem this is, even like specifically like having a link to support or saying, hey, chat with someone right now on that particular page, is enough to kind of give you an idea of how the extent of the problem even.
Thank you. So Shanae, hey Shanae, one of our course graduates, is asking, are there suggested ways to collect customer feedback that doesn't feel like the feedback's going into a black hole, and to make the customer feel heard? She's trying to find a way to get unprompted feedback in a way that leaves the customer feeling great about the feedback that they submitted, and hopefully encourages them to give more.
Yeah. Great question. I think there's twofold. There's one of like how you actually interact with the customer, and some strategies there. And then the other part about the black hole, I feel you so much. And this is one thing that I work a lot with my product teams on, is really building a process that's centered around our user research, where we have very specific checkpoints in our process, and how we do product, where we're like actually looking for, where we start with what sources of data exist to suggest that this is a problem, and that's where we're really integrating all of the sort of different customer discovery sources into our process. But to answer your question, one of the things that we've done, or a couple of things that I've done in the past with my teams to make sure that customers feel seen and heard is almost like putting the people that are giving feedback in a kind of a segment, and then sending, like either tagging them in your CRM or tagging them in your like customer support, you know, software that you're using, and making sure that you're closing the feedback loop on that. So if one of the things I worked with my customer experience team at Meetup was we would often have people writing in about feature requests that got sent to the product team in a weekly report that we, again, had a very specific meeting to review and understand, and we bucketed it by teams. And then we were following up every week to like see what the status of those like customer requests were, prioritize them. And then as soon as like, let's say a team like picked up that bug or picked up that feature request, and it got pushed out to production, we would review that in the meeting, and then customer service would go back and email anyone that had actually requested that particular feature to let them know that, hey, we heard you, this bug is now fixed, or this feature is now live, and offer them the opportunity to give us even more feedback after that. So a lot of these are like kind of almost like on an operational level, like how much, you know, your team decides to build a culture around this. Thankfully at Meetup, this was something that we were all very passionate about. And so people really rallied around it. It became almost like a source of excitement when we could actually ship things that we knew directly were impacting our customers. And that was a thing that we actually ended up celebrating at all hands and whatnot. So there's a whole world in which you know, you can make this a really, really big thing, but even starting small by like, you know, being able to tag and recognize those people and then be able to send them a follow-up goes a really long way.
Thanks so much. Yeah, closing that loop is so important. Thank you, thank you. We have one last question. Let's leave it on this from Don Parker before we do a bit of a wrap up. But what is the best way to introduce a complicated concept without introducing bias or influence within the interview?
It's hard to answer this question without like specifics on what exactly you mean by complicated concept. But sometimes what I like to do is, if it is something that's really complicated, one of the very first sort of strategies that I use with an interviewee is actually to just put up like a screen, offer no explanation, and just say, hey, you might be able to say, hey, this is like a landing page for something, blah, whatever your product is or service is. And the question I ask is, what are your impressions? Give me your thoughts. What are you seeing? And letting them actually sort of talk out loud. That first impression is magical because it really helps like hone in on what a customer is seeing for the first time. And then what you're able to do is start to identify gaps of saying, okay, like, we want customers or we want users to be thinking about this way, but they're actually on the other end of the spectrum and like thinking about it completely differently. So either we need to change either our messaging, or we need to change like, you know, or kind of meet users where they're at. And then the other thing that I like to do with interviewees is that especially in like very complex concepts, ask for what they expect to see before like prompting them with any questions. So it's like, hey, if this is like, what would you expect to do next from here, right? If I showed them a screen, where would you want to go? What are you trying to accomplish? Keeping these like very, very open-ended questions allows you to really kind of see where in like the UI are you able to like guide someone the experience, and where are they kind of falling short of where you need them to be.
Great insight. Thank you so much, Prerna. With that, we do have 1 minute left. So I did want to say a massive, massive thank you to you, Prerna. Thank you for your insights, for sharing the hour with us, for putting together that amazing presentation. Appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. And thank you all for some of the really great questions. And obviously looking forward to hearing more. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Yes. And on that note, if you do have any questions about the course, I've put my email address in the chat. I know that learning and development budgets open up in January. If you want to use your learning and development budget for Prerna's course, it's only $6.99 for 6 weeks of video content and that handheld mentorship live sessions. So email me if you want tips and tricks on how to convince your company to pay as well. And I will also link the landing page in the chat for you guys to reserve your seat. If you want to come into the January cohort, recommend you reserving your seat. It's completely free to do, but do that ASAP so you get on the top of the reservation list. Enrollment open today, so hopefully see you in the course in January. And thank you so much, Prerna. And thank you everybody for your great insights and questions. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.